Welcome to the VP Networks tutorial on managing bandwidth control for users on the gateway controller NC-3610. So the first thing you need to look at when you want to determine the bandwidth limits and how you're going to manage bandwidth on your system is you need to look at what the overall bandwidth of the system is set to. So this is the bandwidth you get from your ISP. And that's going to determine how much bandwidth is available to the various systems that the gateway controller uses. And that can be found under networks and under WAN/LAN. And then there's a dialog here for the WAN port link properties. And so in here you tell the gateway controller what's available on the link. It's important to recognize that the gateway controller is going to believe you. So if you tell it that there's 200 megabits available, it's going to distribute that bandwidth out to users. If your ISP isn't giving you 200 megabits, then when it gets the 200 megabits from the gateway controller, it's going to drop some or all that traffic. So it's important that this number be accurate. Another thing to keep in mind is that it is in kilobits, not megabits. So in this case, we have a 10 megabit connection. That would be 10,000 kilobits. Just a calculation to be aware of. And in setting this number, you need to think about what the service is being provided by your ISP. If you're on a shared connection, like a cable connection or like a DSL, then the site probably has an advertised speed for their link, which is, the 50 megabit link, the 100 megabit link, the, 6 megabit DSL. But if you actually look at the contract, from the ISP, it doesn't say that you're guaranteed to get 6 or 8 or 50 or 100 megabits. It says you'll get what's available on a shared connection, and the guaranteed amount may be half or maybe less than that. So the thing to do is make sure you run a speed test on your actual link. So your internet service provider probably has a speed test that they provide by Comcast. I'm always suspicious of those speed tests provided by the ISP. So I usually use a third party like speedtest.net. And so my advertised link is, I'm on a DSL, it should be about 6 megabits by 1 megabit. But it's about 4 o'clock here, so the local network should be getting fairly busy with people using the internet. So let's see what we're actually getting. So in testing the speed, right, keep that in mind that what's really available on these shared connections is going to vary by time of day. In the morning or in the middle of the night, it may be super fast. You may get 100 megabits. But in the middle of the evening, when it's busy and everyone's watching Netflix, you may only get 50 megabits or 70 megabits. So run a few of these tests and see what you're getting. So it looks like what I'm really getting is about 4.5 by a little more than half a megabit. So under my link properties, I actually have 2 of these connections, which is why it's about 10 by 3. But really, maybe I'm not getting that. Maybe I'm only getting 8 by 2. So in a lot of the bandwidth control decisions that you make, it's better to be conservative because if you oversubscribe to the bandwidth that's available, bad things are going to happen. People's web pages won't load, their Facebook page will time out, and they'll have various other problems. So it's much better to use a conservative limit, which will cause things to run a little bit slower. Maybe someone has to watch their Netflix in SD instead of HD, but you're not going to have people with blank pages or not able to get on Facebook. So it's better to be conservative. Now, one exception to this is if you've paid for a service level agreement at the site, where you're guaranteed, a 50 by 50 fiber connection, then it's fine, to use 50 by 50 in this dialog, because in that case you have a guaranteed service level from the ISP, and generally if you get less than that, usually you're entitled, to a partial refund. But those are not common because they're very expensive. It's much more common to be on the typical 50 megabit Comcast link. So make sure you do run a couple speed tests when it's busy and figure out what's really available. Another thing to note is if you are using a link aggregator like our BA4100 or some other link aggregator, you want to put in the combined speed of the two links. So I've got my two 6x1 links, but really they're looking like 4 by 612 links, but you want to put the combined speed into here, and that traffic will get divided up by your link aggregator automatically. So once you've determined the speed of your link, you can start looking at how you want to control the bandwidth of subscribers or individual clients. So most of that configuration is done here under the subscriber bandwidth limit. A couple options you have is if you set a limit in an account, so if you have a specific account, say it's the shared account, or if it's an account for a manager, at a hotel site, it can have its own bandwidth limit in it. So even if your overall link is 100 megabits, you can have accounts that contain 5 or 10 or 20 megabits. The dynamic bandwidth manager manages all of the ongoing requests. So if there's 100 users and there's 100 megabits and they all want to use the maximum, the dynamic bandwidth manager will throttle them all back to 1 megabit. You have the option of allowing what's set in their account, say it's set to 10 megabits, to exceed that fair share. So if there's 100 people on and they all want a megabit, you can configure the system to give somebody with a 10 megabit account more than is available to everyone. Whether or not you want to do that is up to you. The effect that'll have is that account will run faster, but other accounts may get little or no service. So if you're going to enable this, keep that in mind. This is usually popular with general managers at hotels who become upset if they're not getting some particular speed, even though the system is full of other clients who also want to use it. So when you do define those account profiles, you have some options for how they can be configured. So if you use asymmetrical bandwidth profiles, it'll give you some standard profiles: 1 megabit, 2 megabit, 3 megabit, 4 megabit, but the upload will only be about 10%. And this is typical for things like a cable connection, where your link may be 50 by 5, and so you could give your users all 4 megabits by about 512K. If it's a symmetrical link, like a 50-50 fiber, then you can give people accounts, that are 2 megabits by 2 megabits. These are configured under the user account screen. You can also create your own profiles, and here's what the standard profiles look like. But if you need to have an account that's 1024, by 2048, you can create that as profile 7. And assign that to people's accounts. And so we can look at, so once you've defined how you want those profiles to be displayed, then you can configure it in the actual authentication system. So if we go to local authentication, we can take a look at our guest account. And under the bandwidth profile, we can see our custom profiles are still enabled here. Let's go back and set it to asymmetrical, and we'll see how those look. So now we can see, those asymmetrical profiles. If we set it to symmetrical, this would be 8 megabits by 8 megabits. So that's kind of how that works. So those custom profiles, or the standard profile numbers, can be used in a number of these authentication systems. And if you're using Radius, You can send a radius attribute that will set the bandwidth profile for the user. Again, it's based on those defined profiles 1, 2, 3, 4, either the standard version or if you've created a custom version. The local authentication system can assign it to individual guests. If it's a shared account, like this guest account, then each person who connects will get the bandwidth limit. So if we set this to 1024 by 128, each person who connects with this account will get 1024 by 128. If you set it to a single PC, then just that single user will get that amount when they log in. If you leave it to dynamic, then this user can get whatever is available on the system. As I said, if there's 100 people who all want a megabit, then it would get divided up between them. If there's only one person on the system, then he can have all 100 megabits, just based on whatever is dynamically available. And that system is pretty smart about managing bandwidth. You can also use it for the PMS-based authentication system. When you configure a service plan, you can define the bandwidth that the guest maybe is paying for, or maybe it's part of their free account, or there's a low bandwidth free account and a high bandwidth paid account. And it's also used in the email authentication system. If you're collecting people's emails, you can set the bandwidth that you want them to receive when they connect. So now that we know how to set the bandwidth for accounts and how to configure the bandwidth that's available in the pool on the system, we get to the open question of what should you set the bandwidth limit to? So the simplest setting is just to leave it at dynamic. So if you create a shared account, and if you're using a security like automatic authentication or terms of service, that's what you'll get, is you'll just have the underlying dynamic limit. And that's fine, but it can lead to behavior on your network that you don't want. One thing that can happen is if there is 50 or 60 megabits available to a single user, they may use all that bandwidth on a single AP, and other people trying to get on that access point, may not get any time from that access point. So you need to look at what your APs are doing. The other behavior that can happen is that you may have a guest late at night who gets 50 or 60 or 70 megabits and is very happy to have a nice fast connection, but then in the morning when everyone is checking out, suddenly they're only getting 1 megabit, and their feeling is that the internet is broken now. So there is some advantage to giving users a consistent amount of bandwidth rather than having it fluctuate. But that being said, generally the dynamic limit works fine, but it can have those side effects. So the other option you can use to set bandwidth limits for user is to use a contention ratio, and that's where you look at what's available overall, assign per user limit. You chance one get that amount of bandwidth. So the way the contention limit would be is you determine your peak number of users, and the way you can determine that is if you go to system status and look at the bandwidth graph, you can get a graph of your users and kind of see how they fluctuate over time. You might look, at a couple days worth of usage and kind of see where you peak. The other place you can see that is you can look at the user report, and that'll kind of tell you per day how many users you had. And you can use that to judge kind of what your peak usage was. Once you know that, so say your peak usage is about 100 users, and you've got 100 megabits available on your system, that gives you, at maximum utilization, that gives you about 1 megabit per user. So when you apply a contention ratio to that, you assume that not everybody wants all the bandwidth all the time. And so it's really up to you what you use as your contention ratio. A pretty conservative contention ratio is 4:1. So if there is, theoretically 1 megabit available under maximum usage, if you use a 4:1 contention ratio, then that would give you 4 megabits per user. And you could be pretty sure that that should be available. To the user. Some people use higher ratios than that. You could use a lower ratio as well. It's really just a matter of, what the usage at the site looks like, and how tolerant you are of people, maybe getting less bandwidth than you expected. So this is us. So using a contention ratio is good for hardwired connections where people have a nice fast connection to the gateway controller. If you set the individual account bandwidth too high, you may still have problems with access points. So with this example of 100 users, if you only have 5 or 6 access points at your site, you may have 20 or 30 people on a single access point. And if 4 or 5 of those people are connected at the maximum speed of 4 megabits, there may not be any radio time available for other clients to connect, or they may get very little. So again, it can still cause behavior that you don't want. The final option is to use a defined level of service. So this is to determine how much bandwidth you want your site to provide to the guests, whether it's consistently 1 megabit or consistently 2 megabits or 4 megabits. And then design your system so that that bandwidth is more or less always available. So the system won't be faster or slower at different times of day, and people can consistently get that bandwidth. Now, in order to achieve that, you really have to match the equipment at the site to the level of service that you want to provide. So if you really want a level of service of 4 megabits or even more than that, or 10 megabits, then you need to make sure you have enough bandwidth from your ISP for everyone to get 10 megabits consistently. And you need to make sure that you have enough access points with strong enough signals that when the maximum number of clients are connected to that access point, that they can get the level of service that you've decided to provide at the site, which 10 megabits would be difficult to achieve at a public site. Typically 1 megabit is fine. That's plenty of bandwidth to get on Facebook and send your emails and browse web pages. It's fine for voice over IP and most other applications. It's going to be hard to watch a streaming video unless it's something really compressed like YouTube, but Netflix is not going to run that well. More up in the 4 megabit range, then people can be streaming videos. So somewhere in that range is typical. And often, you need to decide how much equipment they want to invest in at the site in order to provide a particular level of service. So if you just get a nice fat ISP connection and then set the whole system to dynamic, you may run into problems with access points or with guests, getting a too uneven performance from the site. So that pretty much covers, some advice on how to set bandwidth, how to determine what you've got, and how to assign it to the individual clients or guests. We hope this tutorial has been useful, and please do contact us with any questions at support@valuepointnet.com.